My name is Lucy. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words like steady, low maintenance, and easy to work with. I've been a homeowner, a wife, a professional who paid her bills on time and didn't raise her voice in meetings. The kind of woman people trust to keep things running quietly in the background. What most people didn't notice was how often quiet got mistaken for soft, how calm got interpreted as tired, how my tendency to document, to plan, to pause before reacting was read as hesitation rather than intention. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about humiliating anyone or rewriting the past to make myself look flawless. It's about something much smaller and much more common. What happens when someone assumes your silence means surrender? We had a prenup. Clear, signed, boringly specific. I bought my house years before marriage with my own money, in my own name. On paper, nothing about it was ambiguous. And yet, when the marriage began to fracture, he still tried to take the house I bought before marriage. Not loudly, not dramatically, just persistently, through suggestion, through fatigue, through the quiet belief that I wouldn't have the energy to push back. Because that was the bet. He bet on me being too exhausted to fight back. What follows is not a courtroom thriller. There are no shocking twists or last-minute confessions. It's a slow, emotional documentary of how underestimation works, how it accumulates in small moments, how it shapes roles inside a relationship, and how it collapses when someone you thought was passive turns out to be patient. You'll hear about the version of me people thought they knew, about the first small cut, I almost ignored it, about how disrespect can become normalized when it arrives politely. You'll hear about silence, not as fear, but as choice, and about preparation that happens while no one is watching. This is also a story about restraint, about choosing not to escalate, not to perform pain, not to make myself loud just to be believed. I didn't win because I was ruthless. I won because I was consistent, informed, and unwilling to give up what was already mine. If you're expecting rage, you won't find it here. If you're looking for honesty, including the parts where I doubted myself, that's what I can offer. I'm sharing this because many people, especially women, are taught that peace comes from letting things go. Sometimes peace comes from holding your ground quietly until the truth has nowhere left to hide. As you listen, I want you to notice not just what happened, but how often you've been assumed to be done when you were really just conserving your strength. Have you ever been underestimated simply because you didn't make noise about what you knew was right? To most people, I was the reliable one, not the exciting one, not the difficult one, just dependable. The woman who remembered passwords, renewed insurance policies before they expired, and kept folders labeled in a way that made sense months later. If something needed to be handled quietly, without drama, it usually landed on my side of the table. In my marriage, that role solidified early. He liked to say I was low maintenance, and at first I took it as a compliment. I didn't demand constant reassurance. I didn't turn disagreements into performances. I listened more than I spoke. When something bothered me, I thought about it before reacting. To him, and to many others, that translated into easy. Easy to overlook, easy to interrupt, easy to assume would adapt. When friends described us, the language was telling. He was driven, ambitious, and opinionated. I was supportive, grounded, the calm one. At dinners, conversations flowed around me like water around a stone. People rarely asked what I thought unless there was a pause they didn't know how to fill. I always noticed, but I didn't resent it. At least not then. I believed, genuinely, that being steady had value, even if it didn't come with applause. I believed that not every strength needed to announce itself. I had built a life before him, after all. A career, savings, a house with my name alone on the deed. I knew who I was, even if others didn't look closely, or so I thought. Inside the marriage, I became the background infrastructure. The one who adjusted her schedule, the one who smoothed over awkward moments, the one who said, "It's fine," when something wasn't fine enough to justify a fight. I told myself I was choosing peace, that I was mature, that not every irritation deserved oxygen. What I didn't realize was how quickly a role becomes an expectation. When I stayed calm during disagreements, it confirmed a narrative. Lucy doesn't mind. Lucy can handle it. Lucy won't push. When I took time to think before responding, it got framed as uncertainty. When I didn't react emotionally, it was read as indifference. Silence, I learned, is a language people translate however it benefits them. Even outside the marriage, the pattern held. At work, colleagues would rephrase my ideas louder and get credit. In group settings, decisions would be made without checking if I agreed, because no one remembered asking me last time either. I was present, but rarely centered. And I let it happen. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed my value didn't depend on being visible. I trusted systems, paper trails, agreements, logic. I trusted that fairness was self-enforcing if you behaved reasonably enough. That belief would be tested. At home, I handled the finances because I was better at it. I organized documents, including the prenup, a document we barely talked about after signing. It wasn't emotional, it was practical. The house was mine, purchased years before we met. The prenup reflected that clearly. It felt settled, boring even. That sense of settled made me less alert than I should have been. Because when someone decides to see you as the quiet one, the accommodating one, they also start imagining what they can take without resistance. Not through force, but through erosion, through small assumptions, through the belief that you'll be too tired to say no. Looking back, I can see how neatly I fit into the role they assigned me. The woman who would absorb inconvenience, who would prioritize harmony, who wouldn't make things messy by insisting on precision. What they never questioned was whether I agreed to that role or whether I was simply observing it. I wasn't invisible because I was weak. I was invisible because I didn't demand attention. And for a long time, that worked. Until it didn't. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It almost never is. It happened during a casual conversation, the kind that feels too ordinary to log as a warning. We were sitting at the kitchen table, paperwork spread out between us. Bills, insurance notices, the usual administrative clutter of adult life. He was flipping through a folder I'd organized, half listening as I explained what still needed to be filed. At one point, he paused and said, almost thoughtfully, "You know, it's kind of funny that the house is technically only yours." He smiled when he said it. Not teasing exactly, but not serious either. Just observational, like commenting on the weather. I remember responding lightly, "It's not technically mine. It's mine. That's what we agreed to." He shrugged. "Yeah, I know. I just mean, we're married now." There it was. That soft implication. Not a challenge, not a demand. Just a gentle nudge against something that had always been solid. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. The prenup existed. The deed existed. Reality existed. I let the moment pass because it didn't feel worth pressing. I assumed clarity spoke for itself, but I remembered it. Later, when I replayed the conversation in my head, I noticed what bothered me wasn't the comment itself. It was the tone, the way he framed ownership as a technicality rather than a fact, the way he tested the idea without committing to it, leaving himself room to retreat if I pushed back. That was the first small cut. After that, similar remarks surfaced occasionally, never directly, always in passing, comments about our house in contexts where the distinction suddenly mattered, jokes about how complicated things would be if we ever separated, hypotheticals phrased as humor. Each time, I corrected gently or let it slide, depending on my energy, depending on the day. Friends were present for some of it. At a dinner party, someone asked how we'd split things if we ever moved. Before I could answer, he laughed and said, "Well, she'd probably keep the house. She already had a head start." Everyone chuckled. Someone made a comment about me being smart for locking that down early. The conversation moved on. No one noticed the subtle reframing. The way I became the one with the advantage. The way my prior work was recast as luck or strategy or something slightly unfair that needed balancing out. I noticed. What struck me wasn't malice. It was normalization. The way the idea of my ownership was being slowly softened in the collective imagination, turned into a quirk instead of a boundary, a technicality instead of a line. I told myself not to be sensitive, that marriage required flexibility, that intentions mattered more than phrasing, that reacting to every comment would make me seem defensive. So I did what I'd always done. I stayed calm. I stayed factual. I trusted the paperwork. What I didn't see yet was that this wasn't about logic. It was about testing how much resistance existed, how much pushback followed a casual erosion of truth. And each time I let it pass, the signal was received. Not consciously, maybe, but clearly enough. The assumption began to settle. This is something we can revisit later. This is something she won't fight over. This is something fatigue will eventually smooth out. I didn't confront him. I didn't call it out. I simply added a mental note. And I kept listening, because the first small cut isn't meant to hurt. It's meant to see if you bleed. What followed wasn't escalation, it was repetition. The comments didn't get sharper. They got more familiar. Like furniture, you stop noticing because it's always been in the room. The phrasing shifted just enough to feel natural, unremarkable. Our place. When we decide what to do with the house. If anything ever happened, we'd obviously figure it out together. Nothing that could be challenged without sounding paranoid. Nothing that demanded a response. And so most of the time, there wasn't one. I told myself I was being reasonable. Those relationships require interpretation in good faith, that people say things loosely, that I didn't want to become someone who corrects language like a lawyer in casual conversation. So I adapted. When he said our house, I didn't correct him every time. When he spoke about future plans that assumed shared ownership, I redirected gently or stayed quiet. When friends echoed his language, I smiled and let the moment pass. Each choice felt small, mature, strategic even. But what I didn't fully acknowledge was how these moments stacked. How silence, repeated often enough, stops being neutrality and starts becoming consent in the eyes of others. I could feel my own thinking shifting to accommodate it. I began to phrase things less definitively. I stopped mentioning that I'd bought the house alone unless it was directly relevant. I didn't want to seem territorial. I didn't want to introduce tension where none was explicitly stated. Disrespect rarely announces itself as such. It arrives as convenience, as social ease, as the path of least resistance. There were moments I almost spoke up and didn't. Moments where I weighed the emotional cost of correcting the record against the benefit of accuracy and chose quiet instead. Not because I doubted the truth, but because I underestimated the consequences of letting it blur. He never pushed hard. That's what made it effective. When I did clarify, he'd respond with mild surprise. I know, I'm not disputing that. As if the clarification itself was unnecessary, as if I were overemphasizing a detail that didn't need defending. That dynamic trained me subtly. It suggested that insistence would be socially awkward, that precision would make me look inflexible. That harmony depended on my willingness to let certain things remain vague. So I did. I rationalized it in ways that sounded wise. I told myself I didn't need external validation, that my security wasn't threatened by casual language. That paper mattered more than talk. What I missed was how narratives form before disputes do, how expectations get set long before anyone admits they want something. By the time the marriage started to strain, the groundwork was already there. The idea of shared entitlement had been rehearsed enough times to feel natural, not just to him, but to the people around us. And I was tired, not physically, but emotionally. Tired of correcting, tired of noticing, tired of carrying both the truth and the responsibility for maintaining peace around it. That fatigue didn't make me weaker, it made me quieter. And in that quiet, something important shifted. I stopped trying to be understood by everyone else. I started paying closer attention to what was actually happening, not just what was being said. Disrespect had been normalized not through aggression, but through repetition without resistance. I hadn't lost anything yet, but I had learned something. It took longer than I like to admit to realize that what I was experiencing wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a role. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. In that role, I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed uncertainty so others didn't have to. The reliable background presence allowed bigger personalities to move freely without worrying about consequences. I handled logistics. I anticipated needs. I adjusted first. And because I did it well, it became expected. When decisions needed follow-through, they came to me. When emotions ran high, I was supposed to stay calm. When something felt unfair, I was expected to smooth it out rather than challenge it. This wasn't something anyone sat down and assigned. It emerged naturally, reinforced every time I chose restraint over friction. In my marriage, that role had a very specific shape. I was the one who would understand, who wouldn't make a big deal out of things, who would prioritize practicality over principle. That expectation extended into how conflict was imagined, not how it happened, but how it was supposed to go. If we disagreed, I was expected to compromise. If something needed to be rebalanced, I was expected to give a little. If a boundary felt inconvenient, it was assumed I'd be flexible. And because I had been repeatedly, there was no reason for anyone to imagine otherwise. I started noticing how often conversations skipped over my consent. Plans discussed as conclusions. Assumptions are spoken as if they'd already been agreed upon. I wasn't excluded. I was included by default, as someone who would go along. That kind of inclusion is its own form of erasure. What made it harder to confront was that it wasn't cruel. It was efficient. The system worked because I made it work. And as long as I kept doing so quietly, there was no incentive for anyone to question it. I saw this pattern reflected everywhere. In how people spoke about me instead of to me. In how my calmness was treated as emotional availability on demand. In how my past efforts, buying a house, building stability, were framed as resources rather than achievements. That reframing mattered, because when someone begins to see your work as a shared asset, rather than an individual accomplishment, it becomes easier for them to imagine redistributing it, not as theft, but as fairness, as a balance, as a correction. I don't think he sat down and thought, I deserve her house. I think he thought, it's unreasonable for her to keep everything when we were a team. And in his mind, that belief didn't contradict love. It complemented it. The role I was assigned made that logic feel natural. I was the reasonable one, the calm one, the one who wouldn't make things ugly, which meant, implicitly, that if things ever did get ugly, it would be because I changed, because I broke character, because I chose principle over smoothness. Understanding that was uncomfortable. It forced me to look at how my own behavior had trained expectations I never intended to set. But it also clarified something important. Roles only function as long as you keep playing them. And somewhere beneath the calm, beneath the restraint, beneath the years of choosing ease over accuracy, a different awareness had begun to form. I wasn't angry. I was alert. The shift didn't happen during a fight. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no moment that would look significant from the outside. In fact, if you had walked into the room that day, you would have seen two adults sitting quietly, doing what they'd done 100 times before. We were reviewing expenses. Not arguing, just looking. He was scrolling through numbers on his laptop while I cross-checked them against my own records. The atmosphere was neutral, almost bored. Then he said, without looking up, if things ever went sideways between us, I think it would be fair to sell the house and split the equity. He said it the way someone states an obvious truth. Calm, assured, settled. I felt something inside me go still. Not angry, not shocked, just clear. Because for the first time, the assumption was spoken plainly. Not wrapped in humor, not softened by hypotheticals. This wasn't a test comment. It was a conclusion he'd already reached. I asked him why he thought that. He looked surprised by the question, as if the reasoning was self-evident. Because we're married, and we both contributed to the relationship. I nodded slowly. Not in agreement, in acknowledgement. I didn't correct him. I didn't remind him of the prenup. I didn't argue the logic. Instead, I listened. He talked about fairness, about partnership, about how things evolve. He spoke in generalities, not specifics. There was no malice in his voice, just certainty. And that was the moment something shifted for me. I realized he wasn't confused about the facts. He was comfortable ignoring them. He wasn't mistaken. He was hopeful. Hopeful that precedent and fatigue would eventually outweigh documentation. And more importantly, I realized he believed I wouldn't stop him. Not because I had said so, but because my past silence had taught him that resistance would be minimal, manageable, temporary. That realization was sobering. It stripped away any remaining ambiguity. This wasn't about miscommunication. It was about expectation. I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. I felt the urge to understand the system I was in. So I stayed calm. I asked neutral questions. I let him talk. And as he did, I mentally separated what he wanted from what he was entitled to. The gap between those two things was vast. When the conversation ended, nothing looked different. We closed our laptops. We moved on with our day. He likely thought he'd planted an idea that would grow later, when things were harder and emotions heavier. What he didn't know was that the planting had already failed, because in that quiet moment, I stopped seeing myself as someone maintaining peace and started seeing myself as someone managing risk. I didn't confront him that day. I didn't warn him. I didn't signal that anything had changed. But something had. I stopped assuming good faith would protect me. I stopped believing clarity alone was enough. And I stopped underestimating how far someone might go when they believe you won't push back. That day didn't make me louder. It made me precise. After that conversation, my silence changed quality. Before, it had been reactive, a byproduct of wanting things to stay smooth. Now it was deliberate. I wasn't avoiding conflict anymore. I was observing patterns, measuring assumptions, letting people reveal what they believed I would tolerate. From the outside, nothing shifted. I was still calm, still organized, still the person who handled details without complaint. If anything, I seemed even more agreeable. That's what made it effective. When he spoke about the future in ways that quietly included my assets, I didn't correct him. When he referenced shared outcomes that didn't legally exist, I didn't interrupt. I let the narrative unfold fully, without resistance, so I could understand its shape. Silence, when chosen, becomes a mirror. People fill it with what they want to be true. He filled it with confidence, with the belief that this would all resolve in his favor eventually, not because he'd fight for it, but because I wouldn't. Friends filled it with assumptions too. Casual remarks about what he'd get if things ended. Suggestions framed as advice. No one questioned whether those assumptions matched reality. They didn't need to. The story had already been rehearsed, and I let them rehearse it. Not because I agreed, but because I needed to know how far the belief extended. Who had internalized it? Who would be surprised later? Who wouldn't? I also noticed something else. How often my calm was interpreted as emotional fatigue, as if my quietness signaled that I didn't have the energy to resist, that I was already worn down. That misinterpretation worked in my favor. He started speaking more freely, more openly about what he thought was fair. He tested language with less caution. He shared opinions he might have kept to himself if I'd been visibly resistant. All the while, I documented. Not just financially, emotionally. I paid attention to dates, phrasing, and shifts in tone. I kept records of conversations that revealed intent, not just outcome. I didn't announce boundaries. I clarified them privately. This was the part no one saw. The internal recalibration. The moment where I accepted that being underestimated wasn't an accident, was a resource. People who think you're passive don't prepare for you. They don't conceal their assumptions. They don't refine their arguments. They don't gather evidence. They move forward casually, believing momentum will carry them. I let that momentum build, not because I feared it, but because I understood it. Silence stopped being something I endured. It became something I used. I consulted no one publicly. I didn't vent. I didn't ask for validation. I gathered information quietly, without tipping anyone off that I was no longer playing the role assigned to me. There was no emotional detachment. I still felt disappointment, sadness, a sense of loss for what I thought the relationship was. But those feelings didn't interfere with clarity. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't plotting humiliation. I was preparing to hold my ground without having to raise my voice. And the more invisible I appeared, the more convinced everyone became that I wouldn't. While everything on the surface stayed the same, something methodical was unfolding beneath it. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like patience, like restraint, like letting days pass without signaling urgency. That's what no one noticed, how busy my quiet actually was. I began by reviewing everything I already had. The prenup, line by line. Not skimming, not assuming. I read it the way someone reads a map before a long walk, looking for intersections, dead ends, and landmarks others might miss. I cross-referenced it with the deed, with mortgage records, with timelines. Dates mattered, language mattered, intent mattered. I didn't panic when I found grey areas. I noted them. Then I expanded outward. I revisited financial records going back years, not because I needed them yet, but because I wanted to understand the full narrative of contribution and separation. What was mine? What was shared? What had never been blurred except in conversation? I also started learning, not in a dramatic way, quietly. I read about marital property law in my state, about how prenups are challenged, not when they're ignored, about what courts look for when one party claims fairness over an agreement. I learned the difference between emotional leverage and legal leverage, and how often people confuse the two. All of this happened without anyone knowing. I didn't announce that I was getting informed. I didn't ask hypothetical questions out loud. I didn't signal concern. I behaved exactly as expected, which meant no one questioned what I was doing in my own time. What they also didn't notice was how I adjusted my behavior. I became more consistent, not less, more predictable. I kept routines stable. I avoided unnecessary conflict. I didn't withdraw emotionally in ways that would raise an alarm. Stability breeds complacency. He didn't sense resistance building. He sensed resignation. Others did too. The quieter I became about ownership, the more certain people grew about the outcome. That certainty was misplaced. I documented conversations more carefully. I saved messages. I made notes after discussions where assumptions were stated clearly. Not to weaponize them, but to preserve accuracy. Memory favors the confident. Records favor the prepared. And I watched how fatigue was being counted on. There's a particular kind of pressure that isn't forceful. It's attritional. The belief that if something is mentioned often enough, calmly enough, eventually it will feel inevitable. That you'll concede not because you agree, but because you're tired of correcting. That was the bet being placed. What no one saw was that I wasn't spending energy correcting because I was spending it preparing. I wasn't exhausted. I was focused. Preparation doesn't announce itself. It doesn't make noise. It doesn't change expressions or tone. It just accumulates. And the more underestimated I remained, the more complete my understanding became. By the time anyone noticed something was different, it wouldn't be because I'd raised my voice. It would be because the ground under the assumptions had quietly disappeared. The reveal didn't arrive as relief. It arrived as clarity. I remember the exact moment, not because it was dramatic, but because of how quiet it was. I was sitting alone at my desk, late evening, the house silent in the way it only is when someone believes nothing important is happening. I had just finished cross-checking one last detail. It was small, almost boring. A clause most people would skim past, language that looked standard unless you knew what you were looking for. But when I placed it next to the timeline, next to the financial records, next to the documented pattern of assumptions, the picture locked into place. There it was. Not a loophole, not a trick, just alignment. The prenup wasn't just valid, it was strong. Stronger than I'd initially assumed. The property wasn't merely protected by the ownership date. It was insulated by intent, structure, and consistency. The more I reviewed it, the clearer it became. Any attempt to claim the house would require reframing reality itself. And reality was on my side. That knowledge didn't make me smile. It didn't bring satisfaction. It brought stillness. Because clarity changes how you carry yourself, even when you don't show it. I didn't rush to tell anyone. I didn't confront him. I didn't even feel the urge to do anything yet. Knowing was enough for the moment. Knowing meant I could stop wondering, stop mentally rehearsing defenses, stop bracing for impact. What I felt instead was something closer to gravity, a sense that whatever happened next would not be chaotic. It would be procedural, measured, grounded. I also saw something else clearly for the first time. The imbalance between perception and reality. He believed momentum was on his side, that fairness could be negotiated emotionally, that fatigue would soften my resolve. Others believed the same thing. They believed I would eventually give because that was the role I'd always played. They weren't cruel. They were confident. And confidence, when it's unearned, is fragile. I closed my notebook. I shut down my computer. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. This wasn't about winning. It was about no longer being vulnerable to someone else's assumptions. That private reveal didn't make me louder or colder. It didn't change how I behaved day to day. If anything, it made me gentler, less reactive, less tense. Because when you know where you stand, you don't need to prove it. I went to sleep that night without rehearsing conversations in my head, without imagining worst-case scenarios, without carrying the weight of uncertainty. The situation hadn't changed, but I had. And from that point on, every decision would be made from a place of knowledge. Not fear, not hope, not exhaustion. Just clarity. Clarity creates choices. Once the uncertainty was gone, I could see the paths in front of me clearly. Not emotionally, but structurally. There were several ways I could proceed, and for the first time, none of them felt rushed. I could confront him immediately, lay everything out, correct the assumptions, reassert the boundaries. That path promised short-term honesty, but long-term escalation. It would alert him that the ground wasn't as soft as he thought. It would invite strategy, resistance, and reinterpretation. I could wait. Say nothing. Let things play out until he makes a formal move. That path offered control, but at a cost. It meant allowing the narrative to continue forming without interruption, trusting that preparation alone would be enough when pressure arrived. Or I could choose something quieter. I could begin positioning myself so that when the moment came, whether initiated by me or by circumstance, the outcome would already be shaped, not through confrontation, but through alignment, through timing. That was the irreversible option. Once chosen, it couldn't be undone. It required patience, discipline, and a willingness to let others believe what they wanted to believe a little longer. I chose that path, not because it was clever, but because it was clean. I wasn't interested in being right in the moment. I was interested in being secure at the end. I didn't need him to understand me. I needed the system to. That decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt administrative, like selecting a route on a map after studying it carefully. From that point forward, every action had a purpose, even the ones that looked like inaction. I stopped reacting emotionally altogether. I measured responses. I maintained consistency. I also accepted something quietly, that this choice would likely surprise people later, that some would feel blindsided, not because I was deceptive, but because they'd mistaken my silence for absence. That wasn't my responsibility anymore. The decision point wasn't about choosing aggression or submission. It was about choosing structure over sentiment, process over performance. And once that choice was made, there was no anxiety left about whether things would become difficult, only about when. Once the decision was made, movement didn't look like motion. It looked like maintenance. I didn't announce changes. I didn't signal withdrawal. I didn't alter routines in ways that would raise suspicion. From the outside, life continued exactly as it had. That was important. Stability kept assumptions intact. Behind that stability, I began aligning pieces. I separated finances cleanly, where they were already meant to be separate. Not abruptly, just precisely. Accounts that had drifted into convenience were returned to clarity. Automatic payments were reassigned. Documentation was updated and stored redundantly. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just accuracy. I consulted professionals quietly, not in crisis mode, in planning mode. I asked narrow questions. I listened more than I spoke. I didn't share motivations, only facts. I wanted information, not validation. Each conversation added definition. Each clarification reduced risk. At home, I remained unchanged, calm, cooperative, predictable. If anything, I appeared less engaged in conflict than ever. That reinforced the belief that exhaustion was winning. He didn't sense preparation, he sensed compliance. The irony wasn't lost on me. I also prepared emotionally, not by detaching, but by simplifying. I stopped explaining myself internally. I stopped rehearsing defenses. I let go of the need to be understood by him or by anyone else involved. That energy was better spent elsewhere. Moving in silence doesn't mean moving alone. It means moving without spectacle, without narrative, without inviting commentary. By the time the legal framework was ready, not activated, just ready, nothing felt rushed. There were no loose ends, no gaps I hadn't already accounted for. And still no one noticed. That's the thing about underestimation. It creates blind spots. People look for drama, for shifts in tone, for emotional tells. They don't look for quiet alignment. They don't expect the calm one to be preparing an exit with precision. So when the moment finally arrived, not announced, not dramatic, it felt sudden to everyone but me, because I hadn't been waiting. I had been positioning. The consequences didn't arrive with an argument. They arrived in confusion. At first, it was subtle. Small disruptions in expectations. Questions that didn't quite make sense because the answers no longer aligned with the assumptions people had been carrying. He noticed it when certain options were no longer available, when suggestions he'd made casually, about timing, about outcomes, about what would obviously happen, were met not with resistance, but with facts. Neutral ones, inconvenient ones. I didn't say no. I said, "That's not how it works." Calmly, once. The shift unsettled him more than anger ever would have. Because anger invites negotiation, calm certainty ends it. He began to realize that decisions he thought were still open had already been resolved. That path he assumed existed didn't. Not because I'd blocked them aggressively, but because they'd never been there to begin with. Around us, others sensed something too. A tightening, a quiet loss of access. Conversations changed tone. Advice shifted from confident to cautious. People asked more questions, not of me, but of him. That's when the discomfort began. Not pain, not fear. Loss of control. He hadn't been preparing because he hadn't believed he needed to. He'd relied on momentum, on precedent, on my past willingness to adapt. And now momentum had stopped responding. The house was the clearest example. Suddenly, it wasn't up for discussion. Not emotionally, not practically, not legally. It was simply not on the table. That realization didn't come all at once. It dawned slowly, in stages, each one harder to ignore than the last. I watched him try to recalibrate, to reframe, to soften the narrative again, but this time, there was nothing to soften. Facts don't negotiate. The emotional tone shifted around me. Frustration, confusion. A sense of unfairness was voiced carefully, as if fairness itself might change shape if spoken gently enough. It didn't. I remained calm. Not out of coldness, but out of completion. There was nothing left to defend. The system was already doing the work. That's what no one prepares for when they mistake exhaustion for surrender. The moment when resistance doesn't appear because it was never needed. The consequences weren't loud. They were final. By the time urgency appeared, it had nowhere to go. That's the cruel part of delayed realization. Not cruelty by intention, but by timing. When someone finally understands that their assumptions were wrong, they often believe correction is still possible. That if they adjust their tone, their language, their approach, things might soften again. This is when panic disguises itself as reason. He began revisiting old conversations, reframing them. That's not what I meant. You know, I was just speaking generally. We never really decided anything. The certainty he'd once carried gave way to qualifiers. I listened. Not with satisfaction, with distance. Because what he wanted now wasn't clarity. It was reopening. He wanted the ground to feel negotiable again. He wanted to return to the phase where fatigue and ambiguity did the work for him. That phase was over. Others tried too, in quieter ways. Suggestions to talk it through, to fall so, be flexible, to bow, find a compromise that feels fair to both of you. The language was familiar. It had worked before. It didn't work now. Not because I was stubborn, but because there was nothing left to interpret. No missing context, no unresolved detail. Every attempt to fix it came too late because the fixing they wanted required my participation in uncertainty. And I was no longer willing to provide that. I could see the confusion clearly. How did this happen without a fight? When did the option disappear? Why did it feel sudden when nothing dramatic had occurred? Because people expect turning points to announce themselves. They expect anger, ultimatums, emotional breakdowns. They don't expect quiet alignment to be the point of no return. He struggled with that most of all. The idea that I hadn't changed recently, I'd just stopped compensating. That realization is destabilizing. It forces someone to confront not what you did, but what they assumed you wouldn't. There was regret. Not always spoken, but present. A sense that if he'd acted earlier, if he'd clarified, prepared, respected the boundaries when they were first stated, things might have been different. Maybe. But hindsight doesn't reopen closed systems. By the time understanding arrived, the outcome wasn't punitive. It was simply complete. And completion, unlike anger, doesn't argue. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a climax. It felt like a closing meeting. We sat across from each other at the same table where so many quiet assumptions had been formed. The light was ordinary. The room was familiar. Nothing about the setting suggested that something decisive was about to occur. That, I think, is what unsettled him most. He came into the conversation prepared for emotion, for accusation, defensiveness, maybe even tears. Those are the tools people recognize. They know how to push against them, how to counter them, how to wait them out. I brought none of that. He started by talking. Slowly at first, then with more urgency as he realized I wasn't interrupting. He explained how unfair the situation felt to him. How unbalanced, how he believed marriage should mean shared outcomes, regardless of timelines or paperwork. I let him finish. When I spoke, my voice was steady, not rehearsed, settled. I understand why you feel that way, I said. And I meant it. Understanding is not agreement. But feelings don't override agreements. That was the tone of the entire exchange. Not cold, not harsh, just precise. He tried again, approaching from another angle. Contribution. Sacrifice. Emotional investment. The idea that fairness should be flexible when relationships end painfully. I listened again. Then I said, we already decided what fairness looked like. Before we got married, We put it in writing so neither of us would have to argue about it later. He frowned, not in anger, but in disbelief, as if he were only now fully registering that the document he'd once treated as procedural was immovable. This isn't me taking something from you, I continued. This is me keeping what was always mine. That distinction mattered. He asked if I would reconsider. Not forcefully, almost gently, as if appealing to the version of me that used to smooth things over might still work. I shook my head. There's nothing to reconsider. No elaboration, no justification. Silence followed. Not awkward, but heavy. The kind of silence that forms when someone realizes persuasion has no entry point. I could see him recalculating in real time, searching for emotional leverage, for frustration, for guilt, for any sign that this was still a conversation rather than a conclusion. There wasn't one. What struck me in that moment was how little anger I felt. I had expected something. Resentment, sadness, vindication. Instead, there was only clarity. Lee. I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't asserting power. I was stating reality. He asked finally, "So, that's it?" "Yes," I said calmly. "That's it. No raised voice, no accusations, no moral posturing. Just an end to ambiguity." The conversation didn't last much longer after that. There was nothing left to negotiate. When people talk about confrontation, they often imagine heat, emotional volatility, words said too fast or too loudly. But the most decisive confrontations are often quiet, because heat implies struggle. This wasn't a struggle. It was the moment he fully understood that the version of me he'd underestimated was the only one that mattered now. Not the accommodating partner, not the stabilizer, not the woman who absorbed discomfort for the sake of peace, but the one who had always known where she stood and had finally decided to stand there openly. When we left the table, nothing had exploded, but nothing remained unresolved either. And that, more than any dramatic showdown, changed everything. Who I am now isn't a reaction to what happened. That's the most important part. I didn't become sharper to compensate. I didn't harden to protect myself. I didn't rebuild my identity around loss, betrayal, or triumph. Those would all still center the story on what I escaped from, rather than what I stood for. What changed was quieter than that. I became precise about my presence. Before, I existed in a kind of emotional peripheral vision. Present, useful, steady, but rarely centered in my own narrative. I thought that was humility. I thought it was maturity. And in some contexts, it was. But I learned that humility without boundaries isn't humility at all. It's availability. Now I'm still calm, still thoughtful, still someone who listens more than she speaks. That part didn't disappear. It was never the problem. What disappeared was the reflex to accommodate confusion that benefited others. I no longer soften facts to preserve comfort. I don't rush to explain myself when clarity already exists. I don't preemptively compromise to avoid imagined conflict. Not because I'm defensive, but because I trust reality to hold. There's a difference between being peaceful and being pliable. I didn't know how often those had been conflated in my life until I separated them. I live in the same house. That matters to me, not as a symbol of winning, but as continuity. The walls didn't change. The light still falls the same way in the mornings. The creak on the third stair is still there. What changed is how fully I inhabit the space. There's no echo of anxiety now, no background noise of bracing. The house doesn't feel like something I have to justify or defend. It simply is. So am I. My relationships changed too. Not dramatically, but selectively. Some people drifted away when they realized I wouldn't play the familiar role anymore. Others stayed, adjusting quietly, meeting me where I actually was, rather than where they assumed I'd remain. I didn't confront anyone about it. I didn't announce a transformation. I let behavior speak. People tend to respect clarity more than they admit. They may resist it at first, but they orient to it eventually. Ambiguity invites pressure. Precision ends it. Work became different as well. Not because I demanded more recognition, but because I stopped allowing my contributions to be diluted. I corrected misattributions calmly. I claimed my work without apology. I didn't over-explain or understate. Nothing dramatic happened, and yet everything shifted. The most surprising change was internal. I used to believe that strength required endurance, that being strong meant tolerating more than others, that resilience was proven by how much discomfort you could absorb without complaint. I don't believe that anymore. Strength, I've learned, is knowing when endurance stops being noble and starts being unnecessary. It's recognizing when silence is strategic and when it's simply a habit. I still choose silence sometimes, but now it's a tool, not a default. There's also no bitterness here. That surprises people when they hear the story. They expect anger, they expect resentment, they expect a sharp edge. But bitterness requires investment in an alternate past, in how things should have gone. I don't live there. What happened revealed something true, about others, yes, but also about me. About how easily competence can be mistaken for compliance. About how often quiet people are read as tired rather than deliberate. I don't resent having learned that. I respect it. If anything, I'm gentler now, but less available to misinterpretation. I don't rush conversations. I don't chase agreement. I let pauses exist. I let people show me who they are without interruption. And when something is mine, my work, my space, my time, my values, I don't negotiate with assumptions. I also no longer fear being misunderstood. That was a subtle fear I carried for years without naming it. The idea that if I didn't explain myself clearly enough, people might get the wrong idea, and that it would be my responsibility to fix that. Now I understand. Misunderstanding is not always an accident. Sometimes it's convenient. I don't fight it. I clarify once, then I let reality do the rest. Who I am now is not louder, colder, or more guarded. I'm simply more exact. And exactness has a quiet authority of its own. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a villain. People often ask who was wrong, who failed, who should have known better. They want clean lines. They want lessons that can be reduced to warnings or slogans. But the truth is quieter than that. This story isn't about a bad man and a good woman. It's about what happens when assumptions are left unchallenged long enough that they begin to feel like truth. It's about how easily competence is mistaken for compliance and how often calm is interpreted as consent. No one set out to steal from me in a dramatic sense. What happened was more ordinary and more instructive. Someone believed that persistence plus fatigue would eventually override agreement. That clarity could be worn down. That silence meant weakness. That belief wasn't corrected early enough. And that's where the real lesson lies. Boundaries don't disappear all at once. They erode when they're treated as flexible by others and optional by us. When we correct gently but inconsistently. When we trust that what's written or stated will protect us without reinforcement. Fairness, I've learned, is not self-enforcing. It depends on attention. The reason I tell this story without anger is that anger would miss the point. Rage would suggest the outcome required force. It didn't. It required alignment, patience, the willingness to let others underestimate you long enough to reveal exactly what they were counting on. This isn't a call to be suspicious or hardened. It's not advice to withdraw from connection or to guard every word. It's an invitation to notice the difference between being peaceful and being passive, between generosity and self-erasure. If there's one thing I hope stays with you, it's this. You don't owe anyone exhaustion. You don't have to argue loudly to be right. You don't have to perform pain to justify boundaries. You don't have to prove strength by enduring what was never yours to carry. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply refusing to participate in ambiguity any longer. Silence can be surrender, or it can be strategy. The difference is whether you're choosing it consciously or defaulting to it out of habit. I didn't win because I was smarter or tougher. I won because I stopped assuming that being understood was more important than being protected. Because I trusted preparation more than persuasion. Because I let the system do the work instead of my emotions. And perhaps most importantly, because I didn't wait for permission to take myself seriously. If you're listening to this and recognizing parts of yourself, the one who smooths things over, who carries more than their share because it feels easier than correcting, I want you to know something. Being quiet does not make you small, but being unclear about your boundaries can make others careless with them. You don't need to become someone else to be respected. You just need to become exact. So I'll leave you with this, not as a challenge, but as an honest question worth sitting with. In your own life, where have you been silent out of peace? And where have you been silent out of habit?
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.